Welcome to Transform Gov, the digital government podcast, where we talk about technology and data and how they're changing the way the public services are designed, delivered, and of course experienced by us. As always, we talk to the people who are on the ground, those who are making the transformation happen, the leaders and the implementers. Transform Gov is part of the Ireland eGovernment Awards, and it's brought to you in partnership with Accenture. And I'm Maeve Kneafsey. So today we're talking about something that sits behind almost every single public policy debate, and that is infrastructure. Joining me is Alice Charles. She's director with Arup, and I've been trying to get her for 6 months now on the podcast. So I'm delighted to have her. And she works, across globally, really, infrastructure and also urban development. Alice, you're very welcome to Transform Gov.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, before we start getting into the nitty-gritties of the policy, infrastructure and all the challenges, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you had an interesting journey, basically, because you studied economics and international development, and then you worked with the World Economic Forum and looking at the future of cities, and now advising governments and organisations globally on, the work that infrastructure is.
Yeah.
So how did you get the interest in that area and stay with it?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Fermanagh, Northern Ireland, and I grew up, I suppose, in an era of when you had, unfortunately, the Troubles happening. So the built environment that I seen was quite based on security, so on the one hand. But then the other hand, I happen to have a brother with cerebral palsy, and he had great difficulty navigating the built environment. And that's what got me interested in thinking about infrastructure and buildings. And it was more from an access angle in the first instance. And ultimately with the encouragement of my old teacher in Mount Laird's Grammar School in Enniskillen, I did work experience, liked it, and headed off to study planning in Queen's, and did an Erasmus program in the Netherlands. And that was revolutionary because that introduced me to placemaking and a completely different way of designing our built environment and our infrastructure and our services. And I came back and finished my time in Queen's, did a master's, headed off to London, worked for a company. It was then called GVA, but it's now renamed Avison Young. And I specialised in large-scale urban regeneration projects. Planning, development and regeneration was, sort of my areas of expertise. And I worked on all kinds of projects, King's Cross St Pancras, Battersea Power Station, Olympic Bid, Canada Water. That was just in London.
Wow, but some of the big projects.
Big projects. Yeah. But, it was also across the UK. And, then myself and my cousin took this notion of quitting our jobs and going travelling the world as you do and stopping off in Australia. And after that, came back to Ireland, and after working for a large company, I was like, okay, I'm going to work for a small company. Mm-hmm. And I worked for a company called Colin Buchanan. And that was an interesting time in Ireland because it was very jarring coming from London to Ireland. Like I could really see the Celtic tiger, I could see that things were already getting a little bit out of control. And so I was working on a lot of projects, both with developers, large scale sort of housing developments, retail developments, commercial developments, also doing a lot of plan making across the country at local authority level, master planning, still doing work in the UK because of my previous background. And that company, Colin Buchanan got purchased by another company called SKM, and ultimately got purchased by a much larger company called Jacobs, a large American company. But something called the Great Financial Crisis happened, and I was invited to become an external board member of the National Asset Management Agency. So I was on the Planning Advisory Committee and did that for 10 years. And so that was, starting in an era of unfinished estates, hotels, zombie hotels, golf courses, you name it.
Yeah. Skeleton buildings everywhere.
Everywhere. And some were wonderful opportunities that you could really work through, when you see the outcomes in terms of Boland's Mill today. But some were in the wrong places or were built to the wrong quality. So I learned a lot from that. But of course, that was something I did part-time. And I went on after, Jacobs ultimately pulled that team out of Ireland because of the financial crisis. I was offered to go back to London. I didn't want to because I was doing an MBA at night. I just started an MBA at night in Smurfit. And I did that, and I ended up working initially of course, running down all the work for Jacobs, but also I did a contract in Dáil. And I did that for a period of time, working with 16 members of the opposition, and also became an EU presidency officer then after that.
And what were you working with Dáil? What was the project?
So it was really interesting. It was actually where the technical group, so there were 16 members of the opposition and, from a variety of political persuasions. And they decided to pool their resources at the time to look at how you could deal with issues like unfinished estates and water, housing, climate change. So they decided to pool their resources to bring in some specialist expertise to think about, how they could put forward private members' bills, how they could ask very specific questions of ministers and departments. So how they could collectively represent their constituents despite having very diverse backgrounds. So that was really interesting. And, that was working under the Chief Whip, who was then a lady called Catherine Murphy, who, of course, set up the Social Democrats. And then after that, I ended up working in the Department of Environment, Community and Local Government, as it was then called. And Phil Hogan was the minister. And it was as an EU presidency officer. So we had all of the dossiers of the EU presidency. And at that stage, we had complex dossiers, like some of the ones that I was involved in, for example, was on CO2 car and vans emissions. So you were trying to decarbonise the entire car industry. But it was also on emissions trading schemes and aviation emissions trading schemes, which were incredibly complex, not in just a European context. Those kind of issues brought in the large countries of the world, the G20.
Yes.
So in that sense, you're trying to reach an agreement on a dossier between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council of Europe, but equally where, a piece of directive, a piece of policy has an impact on the wider world, there's consultations with governments around the world, business around the world. So that was extremely interesting. And I was doing my MBA at night. My husband was working in Geneva, and the decision was already made to sort of move to Geneva. So I applied for a job in the World Economic Forum, and it was a very difficult process to actually get in. 22 interviews later, many tests, etc. I got into the World Economic Forum, and initially I was an entrepreneur in residence, setting up the city's work at the forum. And it's became, it's now an entire centre. When I left, it was an entire centre, but it was also setting up the real estate industry at the World Economic Forum. And really, there was a tiny little infrastructure industry, but building this infrastructure industry and bringing in not just contractors and, sort of engineering companies that advise and design the built environment, but also the materials companies that provide the materials to actually build it. So I was there for 8.5 years.
Okay.
It was incredibly interesting. Like coming back to Ireland. Oh, I also did a master's in global leadership whilst I was there, which the organisation...
You hadn't enough to do.
I know. And it was the organisation picked internal staff to do this programme. And it was over a 3-year period, and it was taught in some of the most amazing, business schools around the world, from SEBS in China to Columbia to Wharton to INSEAD, etc., Cornell Tech. So it was a great opportunity to sort of learn on the job. And I was very lucky that, I was doing my day job, but then you'd have these sort of weeks where you headed off to China or wherever it was, to be taught in Cornell was technology, for example. Wharton was about really the business case for investment. Columbia was about how you speak, believe it or not. It was things like improv, drama, so teaching you to be, I'm naturally an introvert, how to communicate.
Yes.
So that was incredibly interesting. And coming back to Ireland, it was really a personal choice. My son was about to start school and we decided to come home. We're both from Ireland. And, I was lucky that Arup approached me. And I think the great thing about Arup is that, it is a multinational that has 97 offices across the world, and we work in more than 140 countries each year.
With a very strong connection to Ireland, right?
But a very strong connection to Ireland, because the founder is, he's passed away now, but the founder was Danish of Arup. And when he set up 80 years ago, he established an office in London and Dublin pretty much the same week. And actually the first project that he delivered was in Ireland. It was Busaras. So
that iconic building that we all know.
That iconic building that we all know. And, funny, when we recently had our global board coming over, and one of the things our CEO wanted to do was go and visit Busaras and, have a little photo taken there and do a little film. And we were just looking at what people were saying about the project at the time. And of course, it was very expensive for a young state. But that young state was brave and decided, to spend that money on that project. And yes, there's a bit of TLC needed today in terms of refurb, but it stood the test of time.
And it's more than giving us return on investment.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that we often miss when we're talking about infrastructure, is thinking about you're actually designing something for 50 to 100 years here. And it may cost a lot now, but you have to think about the lifetime cost. And sometimes we also don't think about what does it take to maintain these infrastructure and services. So it's incredibly important that we build that in. And I suppose the final thing that I do is I'm a board member of the Holcim Foundation. So Holcim is a very large building materials company, probably best known for cement production, and they're headquartered in Switzerland. And I sit on the board of their foundation, which focuses on sustainable cities in the built environment.
Okay.
So I also do that outside of Arup.
So we've had very little to do, really.
Very little to do.
Besides that, we have to mention Peter Rice, because in our conversation preparing for the podcast, you mentioned that he's an Irish person who's worked with Arup at the early stages, I'm guessing, and he did some really interesting projects. So there's a lot of connections. Yeah.
So, funny, I was talking to you before we came on air about that, about how this long connection with Ireland, why we've we employ more than 900 people on the island of Ireland. The Dublin office alone is 74 nationalities. So I was saying to you that we've had this really long history of having leading engineers and architects and urbanists in Arup who were Irish and still do. And one of the most famous is Peter Rice, who comes from Dundalk. And I suppose it was really lovely to see and post honour him when the Sydney Opera House was 50 years old, because, of course, he was the engineer behind the Sydney Opera House.
Wow.
But equally, he was the engineer behind the Pompidou Centre. And they've just literally started a refurb of the Pompidou Centre. So again, a major statement building that stood the test of time. So it's often not celebrated that we have wonderful professionals. And I really see that in the built environment, that we have global quality professionals who are designing buildings and infrastructure. And many of them are living here, but working elsewhere.
Yes. Which we're able to do now, right?
We're able to do
technology,
that.
Right?
Yeah, we're able to do that. So we're lucky in that sense. We've great talent.
It'd be good to see kind of more plaques up in Dundalk then for Peter Rice and people like him, because they're people who've done incredible things to the built environment.
They should.
But when we talk about infrastructure, let's go back to infrastructure. It's changed, hasn't it? It's when we think about it, we think of often transport, but it's energy as well, isn't it? It's data infrastructure, water networks, transport systems, as I mentioned, digital platforms. So from your perspective, has the meaning of infrastructure kind of changed in the last decade, and maybe why? Why has it changed so much?
Yes. And so I think when we look at the infrastructure investment that has to happen in this country, it's broadly in housing, transport, energy and water. And particularly when it's energy and water, some of that is to service our technology sector, particularly the development of data centres. And we need a lot more of them because of AI. But equally, energy and water is needed for life sciences. And, we have a huge life science concentration in Ireland. And we need housing for people to live in. And if we are to attract talent, we need to provide the housing for them, but equally they need to be able to get to work. So we need transportation. So they're the sort of four infrastructure areas that we really need to focus on in Ireland. But going back to the technology piece, and you asked the question about the shift that's happened in the last decade. I suppose when I worked at the World Economic Forum, we were in the height of the smart cities boom. And that was really interesting because you had large technology companies like Cisco and Microsoft and Dell and Nokia and you name it, every technology company had a very large team dedicated to something called smart cities, with, I suppose, the biggest investment being in Cisco.
Yeah.
And what they had focused on was setting up these large teams everywhere with an objective of selling widgets and gadgets to cities. But they didn't really think about, well, what do cities actually need? What do people actually need?
What problems are they trying to solve?
What problems are they solving? Yeah. Exactly. So, they would think about light that would also give you information, but people were not asking for that. Mm-hmm. They were asking for things like, can I have water? Can I have a house? So a lot of the widgets and gadgets that were being identified and sold to cities were just not changing anything in terms of the quality of life of citizens. And what we've seen, even Cisco, which was one of the largest players at the time, was saying that 75% of projects were pilot projects and 75% of them failed.
Yes.
So we didn't really see scale of technology. And then we started to see those teams being done away with in the technology companies. And suddenly they were absorbed into the wider government team. The sales guys in smart cities were all gone. They're gone doing other things. So we've seen that that we focused on widgets and gadgets, didn't work. And then, at the city level, there was a lot of skepticism around technology. And now where we are is where we think about technology in a city-related context. It's around what it will enable us to do. Mm-hmm. So the greater return on investment it will enable us to achieve. But alongside that, and very recently, we have seen this AI race.
Yes. Yeah. And that's got a whole lot of things to do with infrastructure, isn't it? That you were mentioning there's a kind of a race for AI.
It's a race. So, recently I was in at the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, and of course AI was one of the key topics. We heard a lot about the geopolitics in the news, but actually in the actual discussions, AI was a major pillar. And it was very obvious to me that this is a race. And it's a race between two superpowers.
Sorry, what's the race for?
So it's basically whoever is the first mover will survive, is what they see. So it's a race for share of the market everywhere. And it's also a race between two countries, the US and China. And there is a recognition now, if I compare the conversation to 1 year ago, it felt like it was the start of the race a year ago. Whereas now it feels like everybody's well in the race and starting to realize not everybody is going to survive the race. And, the NVIDIA CEO was basically saying this is the largest sort of construction project of our time, which has resulted on the back of AI. But the foundations of AI are energy and water. So
in other words, you can't make AI. You cannot use AI unless you've got the water and the energy to service it.
Exactly. Okay. And in that context, in terms of the predictions that I was seeing there, they were saying, okay, from now to 2030, we need 100% more energy than we have right now. Between now and 2030, we need 50% more water than we have right now.
So you perhaps believe that China's in a better position to be
They're in a better position.
And what is it they're doing that's putting them ahead?
Well, what we've seen in China is enormous investment in their grid technology over the last decade. And we've also seen enormous investment in renewables. So they're increasingly becoming energy secure. And of course, and as there's a conflict ongoing at the moment, and we know that China did get some of its fossil fuels from Venezuela and equally from Iran, and the Venezuelan source has been cut off and the Iranian source is
unstable.
Yeah. So they still have some reliance on fossil fuels, but they have been increasingly, focused on renewables, looking at their level of transition in terms of the mobility sector towards electrification is incredible. Seeing the investment they put in their grid to enable them to, source renewable energy from locations right across the country. The investment in solar, the investment in wind has been enormous. So that has happened over the last decade. And, if you even go beyond
it's a very short period of time.
Very
really.
short period of time. If you go beyond that, the way that they've rolled out high-speed rail is just absolutely incredible, and every major city in China has high-speed rail availability. So I think the way that they've rolled out infrastructure is incredible. And also I find it fascinating that so many of their politicians are engineers. So it's fascinating. And I'm not getting into their human rights record here. I'm purely seeing what they're able to deliver.
Yeah, of course, if you are essentially a dictatorship, you can rally all of your efforts and there's no arguing with it.
Yeah,
but at the same time, it's our reality.
It's our reality.
And I suppose is there sovereignty issues there? I mean, if they win the AI race, are we all going to be relying on their AI?
Well, I'm saying not everybody will survive, but I think without getting into naming companies, there's certainly companies, Western companies, that are in better positions than other Western companies. Some of them have lost a lot of talent in the last year. Some of them are not able to get permissions for the data centers at the scale that they need. They're not able to get the power purchase agreements. So some of them are in worse positions than others. And so not everybody will survive. And the same is true in China. Not everybody will survive. But, and also you may have seen, I mentioned it just a few minutes ago, the conflict in Iran. You may have seen the targeting of data centers as one of the targets of the Iranian regime in the last couple of days, because, that's obviously related to the AI race. So definitely there's this need for data centers. And getting back to Ireland, we happen to be one of those locations that's climatically conducive for data centres.
Okay, before we get into that, because I'm really fascinated by this, because there is implications for Ireland, I have to make a very quick, short break. We're going to take a break to get a word rather from our sponsor, and back to you in about, just a moment.
Through the power of cloud, data and AI, Accenture is helping the public sector by blending human ingenuity, technology and a delivery-focused culture to turn their ambitions into action. Be ready for any challenge by adopting a continuous reinvention mindset to deliver human-centric services that adapt and grow with your needs. Contact the team at Accenture to find out more.
So we're talking here to Alice Charles from Arup, and we're just having a conversation about the race, really, for AI and what it requires, water and energy. And then we talked about how Ireland is in a particular position, a good position.
Yeah.
In theory, right? Yeah. So why? What's good about Ireland? How could we benefit from that opportunity?
It's climatic conditions. So in the same way Elon Musk is talking about building data centres in space, on Mars, why is he talking about that? Because of the cooling, that it's easier to cool and it's easier to access energy, particularly solar energy. So in the same way he's talking about space, if we come back to Ireland, so it's cheaper to cool. In countries like Ireland or Denmark or Norway. So broadly the Nordics, Ireland, cheaper to cool. And we also have large technology companies that are already here. So, the
customers are there.
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose there's a challenge though, isn't there, in terms of, okay, it's a good place, for example, to have a data centre might be here.
Yeah.
Okay. But then, we're competing then, aren't we, with our limited resources that we need for day-to-day living as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think we should be doing to try and make sure that we have enough capacity to do both?
Yeah. And that was something that was being talked about, that countries that are climatically conducive for data centres will have to start looking at how do you balance the energy production and water production for housing and other infrastructure as well as data centres. I think one of the things is that we're often competing. If we look at a technology company, sometimes there's a capital allocation to try and get permission for data centres for, we'll say, the UK and Ireland as a bucket. And there's a similar capital allocation for the likes of Germany. And whoever is able to get permission for that particular data centre first gets the project. So you'll find that a lot of the technology companies will have purchased a lot of land across a number of countries that are climatically conducive. And wherever they can get the permission and the access to energy and the water, they will go ahead. So we're competing with other countries for this infrastructure. Coming back to your point around what do we need to do to, to try and make sure that we have energy for housing, we'll say, and data centres. First of all, I think there's a piece where Ireland and the UK probably need to work much more closely together. We already do that in terms of a north-south situation, that the grid infrastructure is a single piece of infrastructure. But we probably need to do that to a greater extent in terms of our connectivity to the UK. But equally, we are obviously connecting to France, and that's really important. So France will give us access to energy as well, that they will sell when our, wind's not blowing or sun's not shining. But the other thing we need to do is upgrade our grid. And we need to look at how we can get energy from where it's at to where it's needed much more quickly. And like an obvious thing is taking wind from the west to the east, where most of the energy is needed. But equally, in terms of the way we look at solar, we need to be smart. This is a country that also has a very important agriculture sector. So we don't want to lose our best agricultural land in building solar. Yeah, we need to cover our buildings with solar panels, as you would see across France and Switzerland. But equally, we need to think about if we're going to put it on land, what's the lowest quality agricultural land that has the highest level of solar availability. And that's the type of location where we need to...
So very strategic decisions, really.
Very strategic decisions.
And do you think that we've been stepping back from some of those strategic decisions and need to be braver, as you mentioned at the beginning?
Yeah. So I think, there was a big impact, obviously, in terms of the IMF coming into the country after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger. And that brought a level of risk aversion into our civil service, but also into our political class. So I think there's been a lot of plans, and we keep talking about these plans a few years later, but there hasn't been a lot of delivery. And I think one of the things that we really have to welcome is this infrastructure task force, and which is chaired by Sean O'Driscoll, which is actually focused on implementation. And, I think it's great that it's an action plan. It's not a recommendations plan. It's an actual action plan that they're focusing on delivering to try and get infrastructure off the ground. The other thing that we do need so one is your vision, two is your pipeline of projects, and that's critically important. And then three is your multi-year funding to show that you're serious. And with that pipeline of projects, they're also looking for phasing. So it's like you don't want all your buses to come at once. You want a bus now, a bus in 10 minutes, and another bus 10 minutes later.
So there's an element of forecasting in terms of what's needed.
Yeah, there's an element of forecasting. And if we think of something like the metro, if you're considering coming into Ireland to be the major contractor to build the Dublin Metro, you want to think that there's a second phase coming afterwards. And if we think about somewhere like Copenhagen, where my colleagues are working on the fifth line of the metro, that's the fifth phase of a metro project that's been going on over a number of years. And, there's a particular mayor that I often talk to, and she says, my tunnelling guys cannot stop tunnelling because it's a large city in Europe, and they're building metros all of the time because it's cheaper to keep going than it is to stop and start. And so in that context, I think we're talking about the metro, the first phase. But can we start talking about second phase and third phase and making sure that we're going through the process of getting planning for it? So I think that's incredibly important that we think strategically. Equally, and we're talking about technology, it's getting optimum use from our existing infrastructure. And that's where technology is super important. If we think of something like water, what you see in many cities, and, if you think of somewhere like Australia, see it in all cities in Australia, is where they really monitor water usage. The smart water meters, they monitor usage. They're able to pinpoint exactly where there is leaks in the system.
Yeah, well, we have a bit of a problem there.
We have a big problem there.
Yeah.
We're about
if we fix
40
our water leaks, we'd probably be...
Yeah.
Where would we be? 10 years, 20 years ahead of ourselves?
Yeah. So, about roughly around 40% in Greater Dublin leaks into the ground. So that's incredible that, we don't have that ability to monitor our
So we don't
water.
know where all the leaks are happening.
We don't.
We don't know where the worst is happening.
Yeah.
Matched off by the need next door.
We have
to kind of direct
we have a degree of knowledge, but we don't have this widespread knowledge that you'd find, particularly in water-constrained countries like Australia. You'd see
they have no choice. They have
no choice.
Yeah.
So you'd see that they focus on maximising the existing utility of the existing infrastructure as well as investing in new infrastructure. But it's also if you're able to utilize that data, I mentioned Australia already, like Melbourne also analysed that water usage data against their residential dwellings within the city to determine which ones were vacant, you know, and Paris did it with electricity data, and Vancouver did it with electricity data.
We'll have to dig into that in part 2, right?
Yes.
Because we've talked about so much, but so much of interest. And I suppose the other thing you mentioned is that when we talk about solar, is that it goes onto existing infrastructure, right? So that isn't just houses; it's factories and all these places that are currently not used.
Yeah.
But look, let's get into some of the nitty-gritties in part 2 about the projects, right?
Yeah.
And what you think we could be doing. I mean, data plays a very central role.
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, we're going to stop there. Before I leave, I must thank the team. So, studio manager Peter Rice, video editor Neil Horner, sound engineer Lee Brennan, apologies, and videographer Lee Brennan. So, thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Transform Gov.